Hi guys, I'm Mark Scott Zickery, Mr. Sci-Fi, also known as Mark Scott Zickery of Space Command. And if you're new to my channel, first of all, please subscribe. I post about science fiction all the time. I wrote The Twilight Zone Companion and Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities, and wrote for hundreds of TV shows, Smurfs, He-Man, Super Friends, Star Trek The Next Generation, Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine, Sliders, on and on. So there's lots to be seen here, including Space Command, which is this wonderful show I'm now doing. But I've been talking about reading the first short story I ever sold because it's as timely now as it ever was, if not more so, because in it, Disney conquers the world. And that's certainly what they've been doing over the last few decades, absorbing Pixar and Marvel and the Muppets and just, on and on and on. So I'm going to read you the entire short story. It's a very short story, but I wanted to tell you a little bit of the history of it first. I grew up knowing I'd be a writer or an artist, and so I went to UCLA as an art major, painting, sculpture, and graphic arts, and and learned how to paint and draw and sculpt. It's stuff I'd been doing since I was a kid anyway. And but when I was 19, midway during my college career at UCLA, I went to the Clarion Writers Workshop, which is the leading science fiction workshop in the country. And 6 famous science fiction writers taught the 25 of us. We lived in the dorms at Michigan State University during the summer, and each week a different famous science fiction writer would come and live in the dorms with us. And we'd write like crazy and workshop each other's stories. A number of very famous writers came out of that workshop. Kim Stanley Robinson, Robert Crace, etc. And our teachers were Roger Zelazny, Damon Knight, Kate Wilhelm, Samuel R. Delaney, Roger Zelazny, and Joe Haldeman. And so it was a phenomenal lineup. They were all hugely famous science fiction writers. And the year was 1975. I was 19 years old. And I didn't know if I would be a writer or an artist, because I'd grown up writing and doing artwork. And I knew I wanted a career expressing myself creatively. And I was not the hotshot writer at Clarion. I wrote a lot of things, but I never sold anything of my writing. I'd had a radio play the previous year on KPFK called Lobotomy, which was a satire of science fiction conventions and TV shows and movies. And I acted in it and directed it and wrote it, of course. But that hadn't been a sale, even though it had aired at, to millions of people. So, but I didn't know if I could make it as a writer. I didn't know if I had the chops or anything. So Clarion was moving along. It was the 6 weeks, and toward the end, Damon Knight, who was one of our teachers, he wrote To Serve Man, which was a great short story that was made into a terrific Twilight Zone episode. He said to us, if you have any trunk stories, things you brought with you that I haven't seen, please show them to me, because I'm editing an anthology and I'm looking for stories. So in my first class at UCLA, my first English class, they had assigned us to write a satire. And at about that same time, the President of the United States, who I believe at the time was Nixon, probably, gave or it might have been shortly before that, he gave a speech at Disneyworld. And it occurred to me that if they just swapped out the robot of him that was in the Hall of Presidents with the real Richard Nixon, Disney would be running the country. Now paired with that was the rumors that were rife at the time of Walt Disney's death that he had been cryogenically frozen. So I taking those two ideas, I wrote a story that I called Leader of the Club, which again is a play on Mickey Mouse Club, because they used to have a song, who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me, M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E, all right? So I wrote the story when I was 18 years old, and I had brought that with me to Clarion to sort of have some stories to prime the pump if I needed them. So I gave this to Damon Knight, and he immediately bought it. It was $50. And I was so floored and so grateful and so happy. And it stunned the other people at Clarion, because it was like, where'd this come from? How do you sell a story? And but that $50 told me that someone would pay for my writing. And my next sale was $20,000, which was the advance for the Twilight Zone Companion. But so a story that I wrote when I was 18, I sold when I was 19. By the time I came back to UCLA after that, I knew I was going to be a writer. I finished my art career at UCLA. I graduated with my bachelor's, and my visual sense has helped me enormously working with visual artists and writing for TV and film. But that was the start of it. That gave me the courage to pursue this career. So now I'm going to read you this story without any further ado, okay? So here we go. This is the book, Clarion SF. It was funny, I was at a bookstore in New York a few months ago before the pandemic, and at the Strand bookstore, and they had a copy of this in their rare books division, and I pulled it out and I said, listen, I'm the author of this story, and I'll sign it if you'd like. And one of the customers said, if you sign it, I'll buy it. So I signed it, and that was the only copy of this book I've ever signed. But here we go. Okay? The Leader of the Club by Mark Scott Zickrey. Tom McIntyre, the 34-year-old president of the Disney Corporation, sat in his Florida office watching the President of the United States on television. So far, the president was performing up to expectations. McIntyre watched the screen intently. How fortunate it was that the real president had decided to give his State of the Union address at Disneyworld. It had made it so much easier to replace him with the robot duplicate. On the screen, the robot rambled on, sounding exactly like the original. At one point, it paused and blinked its left eye twice. Damn it, McIntyre thought. That wasn't supposed to happen. McIntyre let his gaze wander around the office. His eyes paused momentarily on the pictures of Walt and Roy mounted on the far wall, both gone now. Directly to the left of the picture of Roy was a photograph of McIntyre taken the day he had been appointed president of the Disney Corporation, the youngest one ever. Next to that picture was a smaller one of the Dumbo ride at Disneyland in California. Laughing children filled the seats of the flying elephants. McIntyre wondered how long the children would laugh if they knew the Dumbos were nuclear missiles with warheads concealed in their trunks. The voices of the television commentators brought his eyes back to the screen. The speech was over. The president was back with the technicians and would soon be off to the White House. McIntyre turned the set off. He sat behind his desk, his left hand tapping a slow rhythm on the desktop. Now that the president was a Disney robot, many grave decisions would have to be made in the coming months. So far, the plan was working perfectly. The Disney Corporation had been able to work covertly, without any confrontations. He hoped it would continue to be so. He did not want to use the Dumbos, but he realized he would if he had to. His intercom buzzed. His secretary reminded him that he was due at a meeting in 10 minutes. He pushed his seat back and rose. He picked his security badge up off the desk and clipped it to his lapel. What was the subject of the meeting? He couldn't recall. So many projects were under development that it was impossible to keep track of all of them. McIntyre stepped out of his office, closing the door softly behind him. The bell chimed and McIntyre awoke. He was well over 100 now, and most of his body was replacement parts. The bed's auto pump fed the proper chemical stimulants and nutrients into his bloodstream. He blinked his eyes. Today was the day, finally. He had lived for this day for the past 20 years. It was the only thing that had kept him going. Today was the resurrection. He reached the shrine in just under an hour. Quietly, reverently, he made his way through the thousands of pilgrims who had held a silent vigil at the shrine for many months. He entered the main hall. The hall alone had cost over $15 million, now affectionately referred to as Mickey's, and had taken 12 years to build. Massive and somber, the hall was a miracle of engineering. McIntyre looked overhead at the vast network of speakers and realized that even now a subliminal vibration was being broadcast to enhance the feelings of awe and reverence. Every line in the hall had been designed to lead the eye to the altar in the center of the hall. The altar was immense and metallic. A deep hum issued from somewhere within it. High on the altar rested a figure encased in glass. The interior of the glass was filled with liquid nitrogen. McIntyre walked up to the podium that stood in front of the altar. The indicators on the podium showed green. All that remained was the final step. McIntyre had been retired for a long time, but the public still thought of him fondly. He had been chosen to initiate the final sequence. McIntyre fed the proper code into the altar's computer. In answer, soft, low music began. Huge fountains of water sprang up behind the altar. A brilliant blue light fell on the figure on the altar. A red light joined the blue and then a yellow. Together, the three lights formed a blinding white light which radiated outward from the figure. Rings of flame burst from the floor and spiraled up around the altar. Slowly, the nitrogen drained from the glass. The lighting became more subdued. The flames were extinguished. A new, higher-pitched vibration issued from the altar. The top of the glass case folded back. A collective gasp came from those assembled in the hall as the figure in the case sat up. The nitrogen sleep was finally over. Walt was alive. A choir of 100 girls, virgins, each more lovely than Walt's own Snow White, broke into the Hallelujah chorus. The thousands in the hall were applauding and whistling, and the sound shook the building. Walt rose from the glass casket. He walked down the altar steps and looked around at the joyous faces. McIntyre approached him, trying to maintain his dignity in spite of being completely overwhelmed. "Welcome back, sir," McIntyre said shakily. "You've got quite a lot to catch up on. Please come with me." Walt, looking as benign as McIntyre had remembered, followed him into the restricted area of the shrine. Here there were no artistically fluted columns, no inlaid arches, only white walls and complex machinery as far as the eye could see. It's great to be alive again, said Walt, but I feel different somehow, younger and stronger. Could I see myself? McIntyre brought Walt to a large mirror set within a control panel. Walt looked himself over. Why, I look at least 20 years younger than I was. There's something else different as well. What is it? My face looks the same, but why, I have a halo. A circle of light 6 inches in diameter floated above his head. McIntyre smiled. The boys in endocrinology cooked that up. All it took was a single restructuring of a few hormones. Walt chuckled, a deep throaty sound. Saint Walt, he mused to himself. Everything went just as you planned, sir, McIntyre said. Tell me everything, said Walt. It's all yours, sir. The entire planet. America, Europe, Australia, Asia. Africa, too? It's called Adventureland now, sir. We did away with all of the animals and replaced them with robot hippos and elephants. We did the same thing with China and Russia, only now they're called Orient Land and Winterland, respectively. Did you have any problems? Only minor ones. Population reconditioning and redistribution in Europe and Asia was the largest problem, but that's all taken care of now. There are no more problems anymore, no more struggles, no more wars. Your dream is a reality, sir. Your world. Disneyworld. One lone tear rested on Walt's cheek. McIntyre felt a lump in his throat. Come outside, sir. There's one more thing I'd like you to see. McIntyre led Walt out into the open air. The sun was setting. In the distance, the calls of birds were audible. Walt smiled. I hear birds. How lovely. McIntyre corrected him. Tape recordings, sir. We did away with all the live birds. Only robot birds now. McIntyre looked up. Ah, watch the skies, sir. The sky darkened as night approached. A star appeared, then another and another. Soon the night sky was illuminated with stars. From on high, the familiar face beamed down at them. The Mickey Way, McIntyre said. Walt was crying now. How wonderful, he said. How very, very wonderful. I knew you'd like it, sir, said McIntyre softly. So, 18 years old. Proud of that story. I like that story. I think it's still very fun. Well, so thanks for being part of my my life, and thanks for listening to that story. I'm still amused by it. And so if you haven't subscribed to Mr. Sci-Fi, please do so. We're doing a lot of stuff. If you haven't seen the first hour of Space Command, it's a few posts back under the title, The Greatest Star Trek Series You're Not Watching. And we're going to have a Space Command convention on June 20th, live streaming here at Mr. Sci-Fi. Tons of stuff ahead. And if you want to buy Space Command shares or help us along via Patreon, and we have a Kickstarter campaign coming up for Space Command, please help out. Thanks a lot, and we'll talk to you again soon. Stay safe and stay well. Bye, guys.